Hi folks, coming at you with another installment of the Big Points lecture. I got a lot of feedback about the last one that it was a helpful way of clearing up some confusion and highlighting a few connections between readings. One word to describe Carson's point: risk. Nature is way more complicated than we can understand. There's a lot we don't know. And we do know some things, and we're learning more all the time. But changing ecosystems, right? And this is what she's talking about in terms of increasing herbicides, insecticides, biocides, she calls them. I mean, what a term, right? This thing that kills life. That genie is very hard to put back in the bottle. Ecosystems are very subtle. They're very complicated. A small change can have a huge effect on a large system. And what we're doing with GMOs, and in particular, the way we use GMOs, I'll get back to that point in a second, might be a little unclear. So we don't fully understand, back to Carson here, we don't fully understand what the chemical inputs are doing to the body. Much of her analysis is driven by a comparison to radiation, a big concern in the 1960s for obvious reasons. Radiation lingers. We know that. It travels through water, it travels through air, and all of the dangers of radiation were becoming much clearer in the aftermath of World War II and all the atomic testing that had gone on just before. And this is an ongoing issue in New Mexico as well. Families that lived downwind from the Trinity site have been dealing with disproportionate rates of cancer and all kinds of other illnesses. And how the federal government should deal with that has been a contentious issue. But we don't know how long various biocides stick around. We don't know how they add up in the environment and our bodies. We don't know how they affect long-term health. And it's not just that we don't know this information right now. We don't even know exactly how to study it, because science is about isolating variables, controlling the experiment, limiting the external factors, right? But that doesn't happen in nature. It's this incredibly complicated system, and we do our best to understand different facets and then figure out how to put them together. But there's an incongruity between how science works, at least the way we do it, and these kinds of big picture questions about how might herbicides or pesticides affect an ecosystem and end up in our bodies, and what does that do over 40 or 50 years? I want to talk for just a second about Carson and her ability to establish her credibility. This is something I ask you all the time about all kinds of authors in this class. Her writing style is very unique. I think you'd agree. And I think one of the things that makes it so successful is that it's part style and part science. She has a very romantic, evocative way of writing, but it's always grounded in sort of scientific fact. There's lots of chemistry. Here's how this chemical is dangerous. Here's how these chemicals interact. Here's how it can be dangerous for us. I think that combination of that very almost poetic style, but the solid, rock solid foundation in science is incredibly useful. And we saw a little of this in Barabee as well, right? He's trying to evoke a new way of thinking about obesity through the wide varieties of studies and the wide variety of research that he's engaged with. So I want you to keep this in mind as you go out in the world. This has really nothing to do with this class per se. You can be very dry and boring and just outline the research. You can be very sort of emotional and sensational about it and sort of get people riled up. But when you put those two together, that's a potent combination. Building on the point I just mentioned, would the Jenkins chapters be more effective, or would they have resonated with you a bit more had they sounded a little bit more like Carson? He's pretty straightforward, right? He's kind of matter of fact, and that's one way he builds his credibility, right? He's citing a lot of research, asking a lot of really interesting and I think important questions. But he doesn't have that same kind of evocative prose as we got in Carson. The most important point about GMO safety to take away is the fact that we should just stop trying to answer that question. Okay? It's not a useful question. And it's not that safety in general is not a good question, but if you ask, are GMOs safe? That's not going to get us anywhere. Okay? On a molecular level, the process of altering genes is safe. There's just no evidence, not even a suggestion, that that process and the product is dangerous, except It's as safe as far as we can define and measure safety. Okay, so this isn't a question about are GMOs safe or not safe. Remember that binary, we talked about binaries last week, or I did. It's about how do we define safety. And when you're looking at if I eat a GMO tomato, am I compromising my health? Not in any kind of measurable way. Not at all. But if I eat a lot of GMO tomatoes, and there's a wide spectrum of what constitutes GMO tomatoes, right? If I eat a lot of these over a long period of time, and I eat the stuff that goes on the GMO tomatoes that can go on the GMO tomatoes because they're GMO tomatoes, right? The insecticides, the Roundup Ready, glyphosate, the stuff that goes on them, right? That's another layer of safety issue. So the question, are GMOs safe? It's like, is the world good? I mean, yeah, sure, if you want it to be, but you could also find things that aren't so good about it. Jenkins is pushing us to think more along the lines of Carson. At what point do you move from a benign intervention in terms of genes, which are going to be generally recognized as safe, to borrow a phrase from next week's reading, to creating some sort of frankenfood that can be very disruptive eventually, either to the environment or to our bodies? Most gene replacements are very minor, right? Making a tomato skin a little thicker so that it can survive being picked and put in a truck and a holding bin and going to your grocery store and then in your car and blah, blah, blah. Making a tomato that has a thicker skin via very targeted gene replacement, probably pretty safe. But the question is sort of, where is the line in terms of that sort of that safety threshold? When you start making plants frost resistant, now you're really changing kind of the whole organism in a way to respond to the environment in a different way. If you saw people outside, it's 20 degrees outside in the middle of the winter, they're not wearing any clothes and they're just hanging out, and you ask, are you cold? No, we don't feel anything. We're not frostbite. No frostbite, no hypothermia. We're just good. These people are immune to cold. You'd be like, what the is going on with these people? Like, you would be alarmed. Well, we do this with plants all the time, and we tend to think, oh, it's okay. But we're really changing not just, some particular aspect of the plant. We're really changing the organism. And that is where Carson and, of course, Jenkins start to become a little bit concerned about sort of what are the disruptions that we might be causing here that we don't really understand. Nature is good at equilibrium, creating a balance, however subtle. It might take a long time, but it kind of creates a homeostasis after a while. So the issue here is after we start to pluck out genes here and there and we start to be more aggressive in the kinds of things we're doing, maybe we're messing with a symbiosis that we don't really understand, right? And this is where Carson and Jenkins are linked to Barabee in the sense that they're looking for other ways of getting the big picture. Another big point for Jenkins, and maybe the biggest one for the last couple weeks, what constitutes proof? One argument that we see a lot, many of you commented on this in your responses, GM crops are eaten by billions of people every day and have been since 1983. No adverse effects. These things must be safe, right? These things have to be fine. Like, no one's dying of GMOs, right? Like, have you ever seen that on a death certificate? 85% of soybeans, 80% of corn, 75% of cotton. Your shirt GMO? No one has a problem. It's fine. This is amazing proof. As many of you pointed out, this has a huge sort of logic flaw in it. Just because we haven't identified a precise causal relationship doesn't mean that there isn't one. Finding specific correlation is almost impossible unless you know specific pathways to test. And that's certainly not the case for GMOs. There's a pretty obvious correlation with the fact that we're using more GMOs, we're using more insecticides and pesticides because of GMOs. There's also, we know, more cancer, there's more Parkinson's, there's more food allergies. These have all gone up. There's a lot of reasons we don't know, right? We can't ever trace any of these very hard to study diseases to GMOs because we don't know how these things start in the first place, right? So we just don't know enough about how certain diseases work in the body to say whether or not they come from GMOs. It's impossible. Maybe the insensitivity to gluten or other food allergies is really an increasing sensitivity to glyphosate. I mean, we're using it more. We know food allergies are increasing. We don't know why. And it's very easy via science to say, well, that's too vague. We don't know. We don't know why. There's no causation. There's just correlation. They're not the same. But like Barabee suggests, I think very provocatively last week, it might make us take a step back and say, well, maybe we should think about these broader environmental factors. Another important question that Jenkins raises, apart from safety, are GMOs a problem or simply how we use them? And this is where the boundary waters of safety and risk become very murky, right? When we're talking about GMOs, are we talking about food production or are we talking about food safety? And just as Friedman and Philpott kind of talk past each other in their discussion of the fast food industry and sugar and obesity, a lot of people talk about GMOs. You can have a conversation with someone and one person's talking about the environment and sort of how we make food and so on. And the other person's talking about, does this thing have a definitive, detrimental effect on the body? These things are not the same. Do GMOs reduce our need for chemicals? Or do they increase the amount we use because they're engineered to encourage more spraying, right? They're meant to be genetically resistant to the stuff we spray. And here's the big aspect of the unknown that kind of lingers over the readings this week and to some extent last week. Nature is always adapting, right? But so are we, and so is our technology. So I think one of the important questions that Jenkins is kind of building up to here is, well, what's the end game? Yeah, at what point do we just kind of break the ecosystem because we're putting so many chemical inputs onto the land? At some point, does it just fail to work? We might be worried about that. On the other hand, we might think, well, we'll figure that problem out. Technology will always save us, right? It always does. Are GMOs inherently problematic, or do they simply accentuate things that we already don't like about industrial farming, which is the need for chemical inputs, the need for GMOs, the need for super hyper efficient plots of land? Maybe we don't like that anyway, and GMOs are just kind of another step on this long chain of decisions we've made in the Green Revolution starting in the 60s to create more and more and more food as cheaply as possible. And there are reasons for doing that, as you all know. But how much are GMOs sort of an issue in themselves as opposed to just part of a much larger trend here in industrial agriculture? So think about the many ways in which we can discuss danger or safety or risk, right? Individual health, right? That's one. And within that category, there's what happens with small and infrequent doses. Are GMOs dangerous? Almost certainly not in that case. What about small doses over a long period of time, like 40 years? Are they dangerous? 40 years is a long time for a scientific study. What about sort of above average, above normal, whatever that is, for a short time or for a long time? Lots of different categories of danger. That's just individual health. What about the environment? Does the use of GMOs encourage more chemical interventions? Some statistics in terms of chemical fertilizers and so on have gone up, others have gone down, and now we have to decide which is safer, which is more detrimental. So when you're talking about safety or are GMOs good idea, bad idea, you can't just say in general, well, it requires more chemicals or it saves chemicals. Like, you have to be more specific. Ecosystem repercussions, right? What are the dangers of using GMOs in terms of how we use them, right? Are we killing the butterflies? There's a reason the non-GMO label that you've seen on lots of products, there's a reason there's a butterfly. Most people have no idea. They just see butterfly, they think nature and happiness, and they say non-GMO, okay, that's good. The reason the butterfly is the logo is because when you have a lot of GMOs and overspraying pesticides, you kill the butterflies. Do you care about butterflies? Yes, you do, because they're pollinators. Bees, pollinators. If we don't have pollinators, we don't have food. It's very straightforward. At least for now. Of course, technology will always save us, right? We'll figure out a way to have artificial bees or whatever. Uncontainability. This goes back to Carson, obviously. Radiation gets everywhere. It's in the rain. It's in the clouds. It moves across the globe, literally. Another axis of danger or safety is in terms of industrial relationships, right? Is there too much control of our food system and our crops and seeds and so on in too few hands? Too few corporations are driving and dictating what our food system is like. Is that a problem? Are we comfortable with that? Is there not enough regulation, right? Many of you learned GMO products are largely self-regulated. And that's in part because of how safety is defined. Food sustainability is another question. Monocultures are not good. They're just really fragile. Two more issues I want to talk about. The first one, Labeling. Should GMOs be labeled as such? On one hand, we think consumers should have a right to know what they're buying, right? That makes sense. We want more information, more transparency. Is this GMO or non-GMO? But what happens if you start labeling everything? And to some extent, this is kind of already happening. But now you get to a point that so many products have a non-GMO sticker that if a product doesn't have that, even if something has really no possibility of being GMO, are you going to assume that it is or isn't if it doesn't explicitly have the label? Do we need to start labeling every kind of fruit? This is organic, but GMO. This is non-organic, but non-GMO. Like, it's at some point you just have label overload, right? So that's the concern. And the concern is every company, every product has to sort of go through some sort of certification process in order to put the non-GMO label on, which they don't want to do because it's expensive. Why label any kind of product as having a GMO when we're not also labeling the amount of water or pollution generated, or the fossil fuels used to grow it, or the labor exploitation? There's a lot of aspects to food production that don't go on any kind of label. There's a very fine line between explaining safety, right, and however that is measured in terms of the food, and explaining how it's made, which is usually not public information, right, trade secrets. How much do people really want to know exactly how their food gets made? It's not something most people really want to think about. Think about how much we use labels as a surrogate for trust. Do we just feel better about food when it appears more natural? Are GMO labels really meant to signify something meaningful about production practices? I mean, labels have always been about food themselves, right? That's been the point. Tell you what's in the box. But knowing more about the production process rather than just the product is becoming more important, I think, in our society. So that creates a potentially very different role for labels and consciousness of our own food system. That's a good thing, I think. Okay, last thing, I want to go back to the question of natural diets for a minute. Are GMOs natural? At first blush, no. I mean, they're genetically modified in a lab, right? This seems like very unnatural. Really, this question about are GMOs natural comes down to your opinion about human exceptionalism. Are we, as Homo sapiens, outside of nature? Or are we just part of nature, right? This is a dichotomy we hear all the time. Natural versus man-made, or artificial, a product of artifice, manufacturing, something that people do. So we hear this enough and we internalize it. There's artificial and there's natural. Man-made, natural. So on one hand, you can think, no, we're not outside nature. Right? We're just a part of nature. Arguably the most wildly successful invasive species the planet has ever seen. If that's your view, the question of natural doesn't matter, right? Whatever we do with GMOs or technology is part of nature. It's all part of the whole system. Cities, cars, everything, it's all natural. So fine, we don't need to worry about that point. On the other hand, if natural to you means outside the reach of humans, then GMOs are unnatural, but everything about our food is unnatural. Cereal, right? We talked about these things, cereals, always marketed as natural, right? There's no little squares of wheat in the world. Highly unnatural. Even if you grow your own food, the process by which you acquire seeds, the land, right? It's probably been heavily modified by earth-moving equipment, the microclimate of where you live, pavement heats up the environment, probably your irrigation system, everything, all totally unnatural. Just like many sources from the early 1800s put it, there's no point in talking about a natural diet because all agriculture is so outside nature. That argument about whether it's natural or not is just completely meaningless. Right? This was in the 1820s, 200 years ago. They're telling us not to worry about natural arguments because everything has been too corrupted. Nevertheless, we still focus on questions like, are GMOs natural? A lot of people dislike GMOs because they seem like we're sort of doing too many laboratory interventions into this otherwise natural process of growing food. That ship has sailed, okay? We don't have natural food in any way. Everything's unnatural, all right? So we need to be a little bit more precise in terms of what the dangers might be, okay? If you reject GMOs because they are unnatural, you have to reject everything, okay? And this is a reminder we have to repress our reflex for some sort of romantic nostalgia about the past, some fantasy food system that, where everything is sort of natural and happy and so on. That doesn't exist. It never has, and it certainly can't possibly exist if you want grocery stores, right? You need technology. You need technological intervention. You need industrialized processes and farming to have all that stuff in the grocery store. There's a lot of reasons to not like GMOs, in part all the pesticides, insecticides, biocides that get put on our food because they can, right? It used to be you put too much, pesticides or insecticides on the food and the plant would die. That's not true anymore. We can design studies to show it's not particularly dangerous, right? In a particular kind of narrow-minded way of defining danger. Okay, so thinking back to the last handful of readings, Carson, Barabee last week, Jenkins, they're all trying to get us to recognize the limits of knowledge and the consequences of stuff that goes on in our food production systems, reassess the nature of risk, and to understand the complex relationship between agriculture, food choice, health, and so on. Now, the question of fact is so important here. If you agree that our ways of studying chronic, long-term effects are really hard, and in some ways outside of science, we can't totally isolate variables or control experiments. They're not totally repeatable. Seeing, if group A eats GMOs for 40 years and group B doesn't, well, they're eating a lot of other things. Like, how do you really know that it's GMOs as opposed to something else that's causing X, Y, or Z disease? It's literally impossible to know. It's impossible to study. So these dangers then, these sort of unknown risks, which are easy to overblow, but also actually exist, they all get minimized because they're outside of science, right? Claims about long-term risk through GMOs, pesticides, radiation, whatever, they're neither totally refutable or verifiable, right? So they kind of default to being false. And that's what we're told. GMOs are fine, right? We can't prove that they have any long-term effects. We can prove they don't have any immediate sort of acute poisoning effects. Therefore, they're safe. And in some ways that makes perfect sense, and in other ways it makes no sense. So my point here is that all of these issues piggyback on what I said last week about thinking about what kind of discourse we want about food and diet and health, right? If we limit ourselves to the facts, we're going to miss way too many important things to think about. And we don't necessarily have the answers. We don't necessarily have all the data. We don't even necessarily have a way of studying them. But if we just kind of tune them out because they don't fit into our particular way of creating knowledge and the facts that we are comfortable creating, we're really missing out on a lot of important considerations. And the way those develop, it's not through science necessarily, but the way we talk about these things. If people are always asking questions about, well, what are the long-term effects of this? How do we measure it? Is it possible that we can't know it? If that's kind of the discourse we're having about it, if that's what we see in our food and diet and health articles, that's going to dictate what kind of products people buy. That's going to dictate what kind of labels are acceptable or not. That has a real impact, right? The way we talk about things, just in the consumer culture, what we buy and what kind of legislation people can get behind. So it has real implications, even though it seems like it's totally out of our hands. It's all in these giant corporations. Not true. There's a lot of consumer agency. But I think before you have agency, you have to have some sort of conversation. So hopefully we can do a little bit better now after the last couple weeks. Talk to you later. I've always thought this is weird about, like bug spray that you can put like around your house to keep bugs from coming in, and cockroaches and so on. It's really dangerous. It's like keep away, don't ingest it, go to the hospital. Like it's a poison. I mean, it's clearly bad. And you're just supposed to spray it, like on the base of your house or wherever, on the windows, doors, wherever bugs come in. And it's like, don't touch it for 24 hours. Okay, where does it go? Like it's still there, right? If it's still effective, a week from now, isn't it still kind of dangerous for me? Not that I go around licking the windows and stuff, but you know what I mean? Like what happens to it?